Hi, my name is Mary Oliver, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about design equity and what that really means, how we got here, and why we need it in design today. And also, what action steps can we as designers take to implement design equity and be more aware of this in our designs every day. And the thing that started this whole process of discovering design equity for me was a man named Peter Sloan who came to talk to our senior thesis class about his projects, and he just happened to mention one of his projects that was for people with disabilities, ranging from hearing to seeing to walking, and he mentioned the term design equity. And the quote that really stuck with me from that presentation was the power of design to create equitable relationships. So previously I kind of thought design was just for everybody or meant for all races or all genders, but really when I started to look into it, I realized that design equity is more than just that. It's about using space, using your platform and the process of design really to create those equitable relationships. And that's kind of what started on this whole journey. So before I get started, I think it's important to kind of explain the differences between equity, equality, and empowerment. We kind of typically see equality and equity getting looped into the same category, but really there's a pretty big distinction there. So equality really has to do with giving everyone the same resources. So not really taking into account their differences and just saying, here 2 out of 3 of you can now see over the fence, but sorry to the third child who can't. But equity really takes into account those differences in this scenario, the height differences, and sees the need for the shorter child to have 2 boxes to see over the fence and realizes that the taller child doesn't actually need any resources to help him see over the fence. And then really, if these are done right, empowerment is the third kind of step to this process of really breaking down that barrier and allowing everybody to run free in the field and have the exact same kind of experience through that. So how did we get here, and why is design equity really necessary today? So there's a really great metaphor that explains this by a woman named Camera Jones, and basically this is kind of called the gardener method or the gardener metaphor, and she starts with 2 seeds, the pink seed and the red seed, and she has 2 kind of soil compositions, one that's really aggregate, rocky, and unfertile, and one that's pretty fertile and doesn't have stones in it. And she says, I like the red flower more, so I think I'm going to plant the red flower in the fertile soil and give it the best shot for survival, and I'm going to plant the pink flower in the aggregate soil. So over time, the gardener tends to both boxes and kind of notices that the pink flower is falling behind. It's reaching height, but it's only reaching about halfway as the tallest red flower is. And so she starts to pluck some of the pink flowers out and, kind of make sure that there's room for the other ones to grow. But over time, this cycle perpetuates and the red flowers prevail every time. So this is an example of institutionalized racism and how it persists through society. And in her words, quote, "You have the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into 2 types of soil. You have the flower boxes, the contemporary factors keeping the soil separate, and through the inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference." So really, over time, the gardener thinks to herself that she has made the right decision and put the red flower in the right soil, and that pink flower would never be able to survive in the same soil as the red flower. But in reality, she perpetuated that difference and quite literally planted the seeds in different soil, giving them unequal or unequitable opportunities to thrive in the community. And through that phase of inaction, really keeping that cycle going. So what we see here is the need to inform the gardener, or in our case, probably political leaders or people that are making decisions for society, about equity and about how they can implement equity, because if they never know about equity, then they'll probably just look at the box and think, oh, those are some pretty red and pink flowers, but they'll never really see the differences that were perpetuated from the beginning. And so how does that affect the way we as designers design and what we need to pay attention to when we're designing? This is a map of the greater New Orleans area from about the 1930s, and you'll see a few different colors in the map, but the main thing to keep in mind is that this was a map used by banks and political leaders and people that were making decisions about where they could give loans to what communities. And it was perfectly legal at the time, actually enacted by the president. And I'll go through and explain what the different districts meant at the time. So the green meant the best area, the best people, businessmen. Blue meant white collar. Yellow meant declining area with working class families. And red meant detrimental influence, hazardous, such as foreign-born people, low-class white people, and black people. And this is what we know as today as redlining or redlining districts, which really still is influencing in a variety of different ways our communities today. So when these red districts applied for a loan, they couldn't receive them because they had already been deemed hazardous and not really fit for society. So when we see that influencing today, these communities have almost deteriorated because they just don't have the resources necessary to make fundamental changes or structural changes to their homes and their schools and their environments. And that in turn caused the public systems to move away from these areas. They deemed them, not important. The general health declined of the area because of the rodent issues, the insects, and toxic chemicals off-gassing from the paint that was used at the time that may not be so healthy today. And a really interesting quote that kind of explains this is, quote, "People are often surprised to hear that someone's zip code is a stronger predictor of health in the U.S. than their genetic code." And that was a quote by Christine Miller, who really explains that because of this redlining district of the past and this perfectly legal system that was implemented, we've really been able to perpetuate systematic racism through our society, through these unequal, unequitable design decisions. And this translates to today because these are really the communities that we need to be paying the most attention to and giving the most resources and helping through design equity. So we really see that need coming from those communities. And where does that leave us today? So you might wonder why there's a coconut on the screen and some coconut water, but really coconut water is a great example and metaphor for design equity today. Coconut water is a fad, a trendy drink that you might drink after you've had a workout or you're on the beach enjoying the sun, but you never really stop to think about what is going on behind the scenes of coconut water. Really, there's some true horrors of labor and people carrying around multiple coconuts on their back in the sun and getting blisters and all different types of kind of really terrible things happening behind the scenes, but we never take the opportunity to stop and think about it. We just kind of pick it up off the shelf, and when we're done, we throw it away, and that's the end of it. And that is exactly what design equity is turning into in today's society. It's turning into a trendy fad that corporations like to use into their language and talk about design equity in their summits, but they never actually implement these changes, and they don't think about it every day like they should be. They're just thinking about it to be kind of with the times, but not really taking advantage of this opportunity to really look into what design equity is. So an example of what this would be to be kind of coconut water, so to say, is a city leveraging money to struggling schools with high populations of low-income students and students of color, but forcing them to write essays and pitting the schools against each other for scarce resources. So instead of taking that kind of first example and giving all the schools kind of the resources they need. They're kind of just giving one school or a couple of schools scarce resources and then pitting them against each other to fight for these resources. So where do we need to be as far as what we think of design equity? We need to be thinking of design equity more like coffee, which is, quote, coursing through our veins, keeping us constantly alert. So instead of a trendy fad, we need coffee, which has been in our society for years upon years and is integrated into our daily society. So why can't we think about design equity the same way? Why isn't it part of our, constant daily routine to think, is this equitable? How can we be more equitable? And kind of a better example of that would be gathering community input and supporting and funding the recommendations provided, because it's inequitable to cherry pick ideas that match our present agenda. So really what this example shows is that we need to listen to the community. We need to learn what they truly need to become, the same height as the tallest child. And we need to process that information and really take it into account into the future as well, and not just use it as this trendy fad from day to day. And so how can we get there? We can really get there by going above and beyond the design process and acting as an advocate for implementation and policy change, really in our local legislature, using our voice through design to implement these changes. And we have to sharpen, as designers, our intentions and clarify end goals to realign the community to a broader goal of social change, and not focus on the end goal so much as how we got there and why we need design equity in the first place. So putting some, playgrounds in the middle of neighborhoods might be great for the short term, but in the long term, does that really solve any broader social goals? Probably not. So we also need to teach community members how to maintain these after we're gone and empower them through the process. So really, if we're doing this right, we can take those 3 steps that we saw at the beginning and use empowerment as the last step and allow this community to thrive and flourish like the, red flowers or the pink flowers if they were planted in the right soil, into the future and beyond. And that is how we can get there. So lastly, we need to understand and fight for design equity and equitable relationships every day in everything we do, just like coffee. Implement it into our daily lives, our daily conversations, and hopefully soon it'll be coursing through our veins just like coffee is. Thank you.